Chapter 1. Granny's Footsteps. 9 months before, the Wardens had been a wealthy and to all appearances happy family living in a large house in North London. The house was called Thattleby Hall. It was a huge place with 11 bedrooms, 5 living rooms, 3 staircases and about a mile of thickly carpeted corridors. You could have played tennis in one of the bathrooms, which was something Mr. and Mrs. Warden occasionally did, quite naked, using the soap as a ball. It was also very easy to get lost. One man, who had come to read the gas meter, actually stayed there for 3 days before anyone noticed him, and that was only because he'd parked his gas van in the hallway. The family occupied the main body of the house. There was a nanny, Mrs. Jinks, with rooms on the top floor. The west wing was occupied by 2 Hungarian servants, Wolfgang and Irma, and there was even a smaller house at the bottom of the garden where the gardener, a very old man called Mr. Lampy, lived with 2 cats and a family of moles that he had been too kind-hearted to gas. Gordon Warden, the head of the family, was a short and rather plump man in his early 50s. He was, of course, extremely wealthy. "My suits are tailor-made, my private yacht is sailor-made, and I drink champagne like lemonade." This was something he often liked to say. He smoked cigars that were at least 8 inches long, even though he could seldom get to the last inch without being sick. His wife Maud also smoked, cigarettes in her case. Sometimes, at dinner, there would be so much smoke in the room they would be unable to see each other, and guests would be gasping for fresh air by the time the coffee was served. They also saw very little of their only child. They were not cruel people, but the fact was there was no room for children in their world. To Mr. Warden, children meant runny noses, illnesses and noise, which is why he employed a nanny at great expense to handle all of that for him. Even so, he always made sure he spent at least 5 minutes with Jordan when he got home in the evening. He nearly always remembered his birthday, and he would smile pleasantly if he happened to pass his son in the street. Mr. Warden was a businessman, but he never spoke about his business. This was because it was almost certainly illegal. Nobody knew exactly what he did, but some things were certain. If Mr. Warden saw a policeman approaching, he would dive into the bushes, and he seldom went anywhere without a luxurious false moustache. Mr. Warden loved luxury, as well as the made-to-measure suits. He had a liking for silk shirts and shoes made from endangered species. He had a gold tie, a gold signet ring, and 3 gold teeth. He was particularly proud of his teeth, and as a special sign of affection, he'd left them to his wife in his will. Maud Warden did not work. She had never worked, not even at school, and as a consequence could not read or write. She was, however, a very fine bridge player. She played bridge twice a week, went out to lunch 3 times a week, and went riding on the days that were left. To amuse herself, she had piano lessons, tennis lessons and trapeze lessons. Sometimes, to please her husband, she would play a Chopin nocturne or a Beethoven sonata, but he actually much preferred it when she put on her spangly leotard and swung in the air, suspended from the ceiling by her teeth. The Wardens had 1 child, and weren't even certain quite how they'd ended up with him. Although he had been christened Jordan Morgan Warden, he liked to call himself Joe. Joe did not like his parents. He didn't like the house, the garden, the cars, the huge meals, the cigarette smoke, any of it. It was as if he had been born in a prison cell, a very comfortable one certainly, but a prison nonetheless. All day long he dreamed of escaping. One day he would be a trapeze artist in a circus, the next a flyer in the Royal Air Force. He dreamed of running away to Bosnia and becoming a relief worker, or hiking to the very north of Scotland and looking after sheep. He wanted to be hungry, to feel cold, to have adventures and to know danger. And he was angry because he knew that so long as he was a child, none of this would be his. The strange truth is that many rich children have a much worse life and are much less happy than poor children. This was certainly the case for Joe. To look at, he was a rather short boy, with dark hair and a round face. He had brown eyes, but when he was daydreaming they would often soften and turn almost blue. Joe had very few friends, and what friends he did have were unfortunately just like him, locked up in their own homes and gardens. The two people closest to him were Mrs. Jinks, his nanny, and Mr. Lampy, the gardener. Often he would go down to the bottom of the garden and sit in the old shed with the two cats and the family of moles and that strange smell of gin that always hovered in the air. "Next week I'm going," he would say. "I'm really going. I'm going to join the Foreign Legion. Do you think they'd take 12-year-olds? "I wouldn't join the Foreign Legion, Master Warden," the gardener would reply. "Too many foreigners for me." "Don't call me Master Warden, my name is Joe." "That's right, Master Warden, that's what it is." This, then, was life at Thatterby Hall. But there was one member of the family. But there was one other member of the family. She didn't live with the Wardens, but she was somehow never far away. And the whole family, everything, would change with her coming. Even the sound of her footsteps approaching the front door would be enough to trigger it off. Scrunch, scrunch, scrunch. Suddenly the sun would seem to have gone in, and the shadows would stretch out like a carpet unrolling to welcome the new arrival. Granny. She always came to the house by taxi, and she never gave the driver a tip. She was a short woman, and every year she seemed to get shorter. She had wiry silver hair, which looked all right from a distance. Only when you got closer, you could see right through to the speckled pink surface of her skull. Her clothes, even on the hottest summer day, were thick and heavy, as were her spectacles. These were enormous, with bright gold frames and two different sorts of glass. Once, just for a joke, Joe tried them on. He was still bumping into things 2 weeks later. Her real name was Ivy Kettle. She was Mrs. Warden's mother, but nobody had called her that since she had turned 70. From that time on, she'd simply been Granny. Not Grandma, not Grandmother, just Granny. Somehow it suited her. There was a time when Joe had liked his Granny and had looked forward to her visits. She seemed to take a really interest in him, more so than his own parents, and she was always winking and smiling at him. Often she would give him sweets or 50-pence pieces. But as he grew older, he began to notice things about his Granny that he had not noticed before. First, there were the physical details. The terrible caves in her wrists where the skin seemed to sag underneath the veins, the blotchy patches on her legs, the whiskers on her upper lip, and really quite enormous mole on her chin. She had no dress sense whatsoever. She had, for example, worn the same coat for 27 years. It had probably been second-hand when she bought it. Granny was very mean to everyone, but she was meanest to herself. She never bought her any new clothes. She never went to the cinema. She said she would prefer to wait and see the films on video, even though she was far too mean to buy a machine to play them on. She had a pet cat, which she never fed. Tiddles was so thin that one day it was attacked by a budgerigar, and that was the last time it was ever seen. As for the money and sweets that she gave Joe, Mrs. Warden had actually slipped them in to her when she arrived. It was simply an arrangement to make Joe like Granny more. Then there were her table manners. Although it's a sad thing to say, Granny's table manners would have made a cannibal sick. She had a large mouth framed by some of the yellowest teeth in the world. These teeth were stumpy and irregular, slanting at odd angles, and actually wobbled in her gums when she laughed. but how hard they worked. Granny would eat at a fantastic rate, shoveling food in with a fork, lubricating it with a quick slurp of water, then swallowing it with a little sucking noise and a final hiccup. Sitting at the table, she would remind you of a cement mixer at a building site. Watching her eat was both fascinating and repulsive at the same time. Another aspect of her bad table manners was her tendency to steal the silver. After lunch with Granny, Mr. Warden would insist on a spoon count. Wolfgang and Irma would spend hours in the pantry checking off the pieces that remained against the pieces which had been laid and then writing down a long list of what would have to be replaced. When Granny left the house at 4:30, or whenever, her 27-year-old coat would be a lot bulgier than when she had arrived, and as she leaned over to kiss Joe goodbye, he would hear the clinking in her pockets. On one occasion, Mrs. Warden embraced her mother too enthusiastically and actually impaled herself on a fruit knife. After that, Mr. Warden installed a metal detector at the front door, which did at least help. But nobody in the family ever mentioned this, either to each other or to anyone else. Mr. Warden was never rude to his mother-in-law, and Mrs. Warden was always pleased to see her. Nobody acted as if anything was wrong. Joe became more and more puzzled about this, and more confused about his own feelings. He supposed he loved her. Didn't all children love their grandparents? But why did he love her? One day he tackled Mrs. Jinks on the subject. "Do you like Granny, Mrs. Jinks?" he asked. "Of course I do," his nanny replied. "But why? She's got wrinkled skin, her teeth are horrible, and she steals the knives and forks." Mrs. Jinks frowned at him. "That's not her fault," she said. "She's old." "Yes, but—" "There is no but." Mrs. Jinks gave him the sort of look that meant either a spoonful of cod liver oil or a hot bath. "Always remember this, Joe," she went on. "Old people are special. You have to treat them with respect and never make fun of them. Just remember, one day you'll be old too." Okay, so what I want you to do now, you're going to draw a picture with as much detail as you can of either Mr. Warden or Joe or even Granny. Okay, so you refer back to the text and pick up all the little details about Granny. I think Mr. Warden and Joe have probably been described the most so far, so maybe pick one of those two, but lots of detail, and then draw them in a setting which is appropriate. Okay, so you can either draw Granny, Mr. Warden or Joe Warden, and then send me a photo of your pictures on Shovey. Have fun!